But Eunice Trotter, there she is. And when I announced today by email that she was going to be our speaker, I got something back from one of our members in Indianapolis singing Eunice's praises about how important she was to Indiana history. So Eunice, Eunice is the director of the Indiana Landmarks Black Heritage Preservation Program, which works to uncover, document, and preserve Black heritage sites and history in Indiana. She also has her own communications and media relations firm, that's Trotter Communications. As an Indiana historian, she's researched African American history of Indiana for 30 years, including her own Hoosier family roots to the late 1700s. And she, as you imagine, is regularly called upon to talk about Indiana history. Eunice has years of reporting, managing, and editing positions. And in 2017, she was inducted into the Indiana Journalism Hall of Fame. So we are extremely lucky that she took time out of her schedule. Thank you, Eunice. From here, we're going to turn the program over.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank you for having me. This work is something that I love doing and I'm passionate about. This is my retirement job, and I tell you, I've never worked so hard in my life as I have been working the last few years in this program. There's so much work to be done. It is just crazy. I wish I could be there in person. I love being close and personal with people. But I tell you, I'm 71 years old now. My eyes do not work like they used to. So I do not drive at night. So I chose to stay here and use this wonderful technology that drives everybody bats. So I'm going to get right into my talk. I'm going to share my screen now here with you. And so I like to use a PowerPoint because I like people to see what I'm talking about versus me just blabbing on about it. I like for people to have pictures of what I am talking about. So as Rolina stated, Indiana Landmarks launched the Black Heritage Preservation Program a couple years ago. Prior to 2022, it was an all-volunteer effort. And so it had, its moments, and then it had its moments because it was an all-volunteer crew. Marsh Davis, our CEO, wanted to give it permanency and was able to get funding to endow the program through Lilly with a $5 million grant, 1 million of which is for grants. We also received additional funding from these sources that you see on the screen. We provide grants to organizations. Doesn't matter what color the group is in terms of the leadership. Any groups working to preserve Black history and heritage anywhere in the state of Indiana. The only requirement is that the group or organization be a 501c3, because otherwise we can't give you the grant funding. We also have a second fund called the Stan Cox Fund. And that fund is named for a Black chemist who worked at Eli Lilly and died. He didn't have any heirs. And so he left all of his money in this program that funds Black heritage site restoration. So what is supported? We support historical research, capital work, capital restoration and adaptive reuse projects might be a roof or mortar or gutters or whatever that is on a building, on a site. We also support the research and the process for National Register nominations. Also for historical markers, genealogy research, oral history drives, which I would love to see Lawrence County do an oral history harvest, where you would interview elder Black seniors and others. They don't have to be Black either, but people who know about Black history in Lawrence County. And we are building a oral history collection with the Indiana State Library. We're just about ready to make an announcement that it is there. And we're doing capacity building. We're building an army of people across the state whose mission is to preserve, uncover, document Black heritage and Black heritage sites. So I always start from this position here, that much Black history has been erased. And we don't know what we don't know until we know it. So that is our work. We are discovering it. So what does erasure mean? Well, when our history is erased, when a people loses its history, its culture, its language, it loses power of knowledge of self. There's a loss of generational respect, wealth, and then there's loss of respect, not just from others, but from each other, from ourselves. So having history preserved is so critical. Now, how does this erasure happen? Erasure typically in Black communities is government backed. It's the blight and slum clearance programs. It's the urban renewal. Now, some would say urban renewal was actually a property grab. This was changing the ownership of property and placing it in the hands of others. It can be institutional, hospitals, highways, schools. Erasure also is self-imposed. It comes from neglect and abandonment of property. You know, and I know, and my kids are probably like many of your kids, they don't want grandma's old house. They don't want it, and they let it go. They sell it, or they just walk away from it, and they move to the areas where other yuppies are, and that's where they spend their resources. Then about the time they get 56 years old, they regret not keeping grandma's house, because grandma's house is the place where memories were made. And also, it's the place where gentrification often occurs. Typically, African-American communities were in the centers of cities and moved out from those centers as they were displaced. So when did erasure become really significant? Well, it began to happen after the National Industrial Recovery Housing Act. Now, this act provided cities all across the country with lots of money for blight removal. And again, we believe it was to reclaim property. So here in Indianapolis, at I-65 and 70, you guys probably come in and out of the city, you know, Highway 65 and 70. Well, at the juncture of 65 and 70 on the west side of Indianapolis was an all-Black community. And this community was totally displaced. You'll see in the picture on the left what it used to be as they were beginning to clear out all of that housing. All of this area was housing where these areas are, where the highway is being built. 17,000 people were relocated, 8,000 homes, 29 churches. You see in the picture on the right, that one house still standing, you know, in the middle of all of this pavement that supports these office buildings and schools all around it. So what we're doing now is we're building capacity to stop erasure. Now, how are we building capacity? We're doing it through internships and scholarships. We are awarding young people who are interested in the preservation field a $20,000 scholarship and also internships where they work with me in the summer. This is going to be the third year of interns this year. So we have typically 4 or 5 young people from Ball State or Notre Dame or Purdue who come in and spend the summer with me. And I tell you, it's really interesting because this last summer I had an eye-opening experience with a couple of the very smart young people. And that experience was they did not know how to write cursive or read it. And they are in college, juniors and seniors in college. So needless to say, they learned how to write cursive before they left here. I drilled them all summer and they became very proficient in reading and writing cursive. They can't read historical documents. You know, in the preservation field, you have to be able to read cursive writing. There's no doubt about it. So those are the kind of challenges that we're having. We're also farming Black heritage preservation groups statewide. I had initially wanted these groups to be Black-led because I believe a people should write their own history. Others shouldn't write it for them. But what I have learned is that most history about African Americans is not written by African Americans. It is written by others, name the race, and they're writing the history. And so I felt some kind of way initially, but that feeling turned into real joy because if not for the work that many of my ally white brothers and sisters are doing, it wouldn't be done. We have found that less than 2% of all people in this preservation field, that includes historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, architecture, uh, public history, journalism, are Black. 2% or less are Black. So what we're doing is we're creating volunteer organizations all across the state, and we are pairing these groups of people with historical societies, preservation organizations, and others who know what they're doing. They know how to get something on the National Register. They know how to get a historical marker. And we're teaching them how to do the work so that they can then go off and do the work themselves. And it's been a real interesting experiment for me because I tell you, my Vincennes group, which is in your neck of the woods, pretty close to you, a couple counties away, is performing extremely well. This Saturday, they're going to have an oral history harvest, and it's been in the paper and on television, and they're expecting a big turnout. We're giving them support to collect these oral histories, and those oral histories will be turned over for our collection. We've got a great group, and the Vincennes group, by the way, is run by Tom Bartholomew, who is a retired white guy who used to work at the newspaper there, and he's retired. He and his wife are leading that effort. But they have brought in African Americans in Knox County, and they are really working together well. Fort Wayne. Fort Wayne is run by, I call them a salt and pepper group. They're very diverse there. They're doing the work. Marion, we've got a great group going. Terre Haute, we're starting a group. Lafayette, Evansville, Seymour, Hammond. Lawrence County has some rich Black history. We like to see some more work there. And I am really respectful and happy about the work that is taking place through the efforts of Rowena. We are also building partnerships. That is so important. Folks, I'm a one-man band. Even though Indiana Landmarks has 9 regional offices across the state, each of those offices is more or less a one-man band too, and they each have 17, 18 counties to manage in terms of saving the historical structures in those counties. So they can't give me a whole lot of help, but I am getting help from these partners. Ball State has done a studio project in Madison, Indiana, in the Georgetown area, which was a historically Black community. Purdue is doing a survey. The Nature Conservancy has reached out to us and is funding an intern. The Nature Conservancy has found that many of the state's nature preserves were once Black settlements that have reverted to nature. These places were places where African American communities were started before the Civil War. The Historical Society, the State Library, IU Center for Rural Engagement. Now that's a great partner. I don't want to say good, they're a great partner. They have also provided an intern to help me do the work. They focus on smaller communities, and Bedford could definitely qualify. They help pay for doing the research. They help organize. They help me however I need help. So we've been working in Daviess County and also in Knox County getting organized. And interestingly, I don't know if this is happening in Lawrence County yet, but interestingly, as I work with the Nature Preserve and travel to some of these communities through the work that I do for Indiana Landmarks, I'm finding a huge growing population of Haitians. And, that is just a tempest waiting to, reach the brim. Because they're just kind of plopped into these communities. They don't speak the language. They're Black. And you know what time we're living in now. So it's interesting seeing what's going on there. Um, we preserve sites with Black historic significance. And these sites are so important because they're what connect us. They're our home to our stories. In the past, historically, preservationists have focused on buildings. The very ornate, beautiful Romanesque, Greek revival, architecturally beautiful buildings. We have found that in focusing on buildings, you don't focus on the people. The people make the building, the people make the stories, not the building. And so more and more, we are looking at the heritage and not just the building. So it doesn't matter if it is a high architecturally designed building for Black heritage, because most of our significant sites are not of high architecture. So if that was the only criteria, very few of them would be eligible for National Register status. And I'll quickly tell you about being on the National Register. You probably know this anyway, but because Lawrence County has a lot of historically significant buildings. But being on the National Register is a prestigious designation. It opens the door to federal grants and tax credits. It does not restrict what you can or cannot do to the property. You can paint it purple. You can do whatever you want. Now, if you do those things, it could lead to you being designated. However, the designation does not stop you from doing things to your property. The only way that a property, a site of significance is protected is through the local designation of a local municipal historic preservation commission. That is the only way that a site is protected. And I know you guys have a historic district down there too that is protected. But being on the National Register is a wonderful designation. It's a distinction. So I want to show you some of the projects that we're working on to stop the erasure of these very important sites. What you're looking at now is Gary Roosevelt High School. It's a rendering of what we want that site to look like. Right now, that's a school that has been closed for several years. The classes ended on a Friday. The students and the staff got up, left, and it was locked up, and it's been that way for 7-8 years. We are looking for an adaptive reuse of this site. As we all know, Gary is extremely depressed. There has been significant disinvestment and population loss. Businesses fled Gary, starting when Mayor Hatcher became mayor. He was the first Black mayor in Gary. And that's when disinvestment began. And it just continued with the loss of the steel mill industry. People had no work. And it's when you go to Gary, I tell people when I go to Gary, every intersection is a 4-way stop because none of the stoplights work. So, with that, you can just see how poor the city is. So we're pouring resources into saving this very important school site. Gary Roosevelt High School is one of 3 high schools built in Indiana in the 1920s and 30s for African Americans when Indiana resegregated the high schools. Gary Roosevelt is one of the schools. Crispus Attucks here in Indianapolis is another, and Lincoln High School in Evansville is the 3rd. Lincoln was demolished. It no longer exists. Crispus Attucks was on the chopping block, but the alumni made such a fuss, the school authorities backed off, and it still is thriving and in existence. And Gary Roosevelt was closed by the state after the school's boiler system needed repair, and it became unaffordable. So it's just been sitting there deteriorating and deteriorating and deteriorating. A lot of the records have been vandalized. The school has been really very well protected by the community, but we can tell that the protection is kind of, subsiding because there's been graffiti on the walls and people breaking in and that kind of thing. So we're really working hard on this site. Another site is a church here in Indy, Phillips Temple, a Black Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. The C used to stand for Colored Methodist Episcopal, but it became in the 60s Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. And this is a church here in Indy that needs help in buying a new roof. There's a leakage going on. We don't want this beautiful structure to deteriorate. This is a school in Indy that was built for African Americans here in Indianapolis. It was on the chopping block to be demolished. This perfectly good building was going to be torn down so that a new school could be built there. This school is in an area that is going through heavy gentrification, and they wanted a new school. So we pushed back and gave them all the history and made them understand why this is crazy, to think about tearing this beautiful building down, terrazzo flooring. I mean, these windows were designed. You don't see schools nowadays built with windows like this. These windows were so that sunlight could come in, that these rooms would have natural lighting. And there's so many other features in this building that you don't see in new buildings. This is the Union Literary Institute in Randolph County. It was falling down. We have supported work to build this wall here. The Union Literary Institute was an interracial institution that educated both men and women, Black and white. It is where Hiram Rebels, the nation's first African-American elected to federal office, went to school. There's just a significant list of people who came to be very notable in U.S. history who went to this school. So this is a significant site. This is a building that housed the Colored Knights of Pythias. You might be familiar with the Knights of Pythias. Well, the Colored Knights of Pythias was organized as a resistance to not being able to join the Knights of Pythias. And in this building, all kinds of civic and social and political activities took place. This building is now under renovation, and we're helping in that project. And then this is Allen Chapel in Terre Haute. It's the oldest Black church in Terre Haute. Urban renewal came to Terre Haute in the 60s and 70s. And all of the housing that used to exist, all in that neighborhood around that church, is gone, like they never existed. But that church is evidence that this was a Black community, and it still stands today and is used by the community today. Now, here in Lawrence County, like I said, there's so many beautiful buildings and so much significant history. What you're looking at is a picture of the former Lawrence County Sheriff's residence and jails, Romanesque Revival style, built in 1904. And it was built around a jail that was built in 1859. And it's still standing pretty much intact as it was. For African Americans, this place is not a place of beauty. It was a place of terror. It is from jails that mobs often took Black prisoners and hung them in lynchings. Now, interestingly, Lawrence County has a real tame history compared to other counties in Indiana, particularly in the southern part of the state. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But this is Bedford's Elks Lodge. African Americans created their own lodge modeled after the lodges that were in their communities. And they had built houses and sites for their lodges as well. This is also under renovation. I'm not sure how far along they are with this project, but it is another building there in Lawrence County in Bedford. Now, there is uncomfortable history in Lawrence County, Bedford, and the other couple communities around it. These articles kind of report some of that history, but I found this one article that was very interesting to me. You see these two articles on the left. This one article talks about the large crowds attending a KKK picnic. And it says this place was the scene of much activity last Saturday when an all-day picnic and barbecue was held at the new Speedway by the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. A crowd of about 5,000 persons thronged the Speedway grounds and listened to a number of well-known speakers give patriotic addresses, and it goes on from there. Now, this one is another article about another event at another time. This is in 1926, and it talks about a parade of 2,000 Klansmen marched through Bedford. And this talks about this float representing a drinking and gambling crowd of men and women, presided over by a red devil with horns and surmounted by the inscription, "Me and my kind do not like the KKK." And this attracted a lot of attention. So there were all kind of floats. This was like a big blowout event. So that tells me there was some complicity in Lawrence County as it relates to the Klan, or else they wouldn't have been able to be there. However, there was this article that I found that talks about an anti-Klan movement has been launched in Bedford to combat the rapid growth of Americanism in Lawrence County. Owing to the great interest in all things American in this community, it seems like a hopeless task for the aliens. It is understood that a church with a foreign head is behind the movement, and it goes on. So this was talking about this growing anti-Klan movement that was occurring in Bedford. In other words, there are people who weren't going to put up with that there in Bedford. So now I want to talk a little bit about our history in Indiana. And I want to clarify what you may have been taught in high school and even in college about Indiana. Now, we're taught that Indiana was a free state, but Indiana was a slave state. It was not by the laws of our state, but by the practices of our highest officials, including judges and legislators. So I want to show you this map that was created in the 1780s. Well, actually, it was started in the 1760s. And you'll see this sign here in the corner of the picture. This is a picture of an actual Mason-Dixon lines sign that I took when I drove the line. You see the white line here. This is the line that marks the separating boundary of slave states here in the gray, and the states that were not slave states. In the green are border states, and those are Kentucky and Missouri. But you see, here's Indiana. It's in blue, and it's supposed to be a free state. Now, Indiana was in an area that always banned slavery and indentured servitude. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was created by the Confederation Congress to create the first organized territory of the United States. African Americans were in Indiana before the Northwest Territorial Ordinance was created. And so the evidence of that I have is records at the St. Xavier Church in Vincennes, Indiana, where in French is written entry after entry of African Americans being born, getting married, having children. These life events were recorded by the Catholic Church in Vincennes in the 1600s when the people from that church came into this country. Now, the states that were part of the Northwest Territory, those that you see, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota. I would say that all of these states condone slavery. Now, here's the article in that ordinance that says there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in this territory except for the punishment of crime. That was in 1787. So I noted too that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, comes into play just 6 years after this was named a territory. So Vincennes, Indiana, you see here in green, was the capital of the territory. It is in this county, Knox County, where the battles over whether Indiana was going to be a free state or a slave state took place. And this arrow that you see here points to where Lawrence is, Lawrence County. So here's Knox, and we're just a few counties apart. Davies, Martin, bam, there's Lawrence. So in 1803, territorial governor William Henry Harrison and his general court judges enacted laws that undermined or skirted the ban on slavery and involuntary servitude. Now, they did this for a number of reasons, both personal and civic focus. However, the most significant reason was the need for labor to help clear this land and to do all the things that needed to be done to make this a habitable country, a habitable territory. They also came from cultures that condoned slavery. Many of our state's highest officials came from slave states. They grew up with slaves in their family, in their households, on their properties. That's what they knew. And so they wanted to continue that culture, that practice. And so they created laws that would skirt that requirement that there be neither slavery nor indentured servitude. And they did it through the creation of indenture contracts. Now, these are actual pictures of contracts. So I know that you can't read this or see them very well, but we've found several all over the lower third of the state. And we've been digitizing them. And these, I hope Lawrence County will really dig to see if there are any on file there. Because what happened is the people who held these indenture contracts, the enslavers, if you will, had to record these with the clerk's offices. And so that is how a lot of these came into the control of municipalities, that when they were recorded, they were able to gather, acquire, and accumulate these contracts. And basically, these contracts say that the person, the enslaved person who was a slave when they were brought into Indiana, typically from Kentucky or North Carolina or Virginia or Tennessee, had to sign these contracts. And if they refused to sign them, they could be taken deeper south and sold into slavery. You've heard the term sold down the river. Well, that referred to slaves. They were actually sold down the river. They went from the Ohio to the Mississippi down into Louisiana and other parts south if they refused to sign these contracts. These contracts required them to agree to work for free, except for food to eat and something to wear. It didn't even provide housing in many cases for 30, 60, 99 years. Now, in school, we're taught that indentured servants were typically people who had to work off the cost of their passage when they came here from European countries, 6, 7, 8 years. In the cases of children, they were indentured until they reached maturity and had a skill that could support them. But for African Americans who arrived in Indiana, they were indentured for their lifetime. So, and also the condition was no different for them. They could be beaten in public or private. They could be restricted in terms of their movements and so forth. So in 1816, Indiana became a state. And in the state constitution, the same clause as in the territorial ordinance was adopted, banning slavery and involuntary servitude. And so that is the beginning of our state's history. I was able to find a little bit about who some of the first African Americans in Lawrence County were. I'm seeing that the first ones are documented in about 1820. That's just a couple years after the formation of Lawrence County. And you know, you can't really rely on records to tell the full story because, you know, particularly runaway enslaved people aren't going to stand up and say, hey, count me, you know. So I believe that they probably were there earlier. These are some of the last names of some of the earliest families there that you see listed here at the bottom. Now, we don't have real thorough history on African Americans in Lawrence County, and I know that work is going on now, and I'm so grateful to know that and that it is going on because this needs to be documented. This history needs to be documented. But what has been documented is the fact that many of our state's highest officials and leaders were slave owners. And, you know, I make jokes about them all the time. I'll say, well, Henry Clay was a nice man. So was Francis Vigo and Henry Vanderburgh and William Henry Harrison. They were wonderful people, but they were also slave owners. They sold and bought people. Many Indiana counties are named after slave owners. Now, the African American community in Indiana has never been as, what should I say, outspoken and vocal as the case in some counties, particularly in the Deep South. And I think the reason I believe that to be the case is because our level of discomfort is not as bad as it is in the Deep South. So, you know, we don't fuss about the small stuff. A lot of African Americans in Indiana, including my own father, became members of a Garveyite movement in the late 1800s into the 1900s. And this movement was not a racist movement. It was a self-sufficiency movement. It was don't try to press your way into places where you're not wanted. Do your own thing, get your own, pick your own self up, help your own community, teach your own kids. And so that movement was pretty strong in Indiana. So you have a lot of folks who followed that philosophy of Marcus Garvey. So I want to talk about a couple of cases that happened in 1821 that changed things in Indiana. The first case that I want to talk about is the Polly and James Strong case. These were court cases that I'm going to talk about that helped make sure there was not slavery in Indiana. And this is information, like I said, that should be in our state history book, but it isn't. It's some of that erased history. Polly and James Strong were born enslaved and in the 1790s. And that's another thing I wanted to share with you. It's politically correct, for lack of a better way to describe it, to say enslaved people versus slaves. Because slaves denotes a agreement with this condition. When there was no agreement, there was nothing that these people could have done or not done. They were enslaved. So we call them enslaved people versus slaves. So Polly and James were born in the 1790s in Knox County. And they were born to a woman who had been enslaved to a man by the name of Hyacinth LaSalle. And this growing tension between the abolitionists, or people who were against slavery, and those who supported it, began to reach a crescendo. So Attorney Moses Tabbs asked for a writ of habeas corpus to have Polly and James Strong freed from their indenture, from their enslavement. And that case went to court and it was dismissed in 1819. Well, the judge was a slave owner. And then the following year, attorneys John Osborne and Amory Kinney took this case to the state Supreme Court. The question was, can a person be born into enslavement or slavery in Indiana when Indiana was a free state? And the Supreme Court issued a precedent-setting decision that said no, there can be no slavery in Indiana, and therefore Polly and James had to be freed from that state. We don't know what happened with Polly or with James Strong. We do know that there were other court cases that involved them with some debt and some other issues, but then they disappeared from the record, so we have no idea what happened to them. The other case is of a woman who we do know what happened to, and I am one of her offsprings. This woman was my own great-great-great-grandmother. Mary Bateman Clark was born into slavery in Kentucky. She was brought to Knox County, Indiana, by Benjamin Johnston Harrison. Now, Benjamin Johnson was related to William Henry Harrison and to another man I'm going to tell you more about, whose last name is Johnston, and he is cited as the founder of Masonry in Indiana. And we all know Indiana is a big Mason state. There's Masonic orders all over the place. And this man, General Washington Johnston, G.W. Johnston, is the person credited with bringing the charter to Indiana so that there could be Masonic groups here in this state. So she was brought to Indiana by Benjamin Harrison from Kentucky. I did research and found that the Harrison family had several slaves in the Louisville area of Kentucky, and he moved to Indiana. He became the city clerk for Vincennes. Now, the law required that whenever an enslaved person was brought into Vincennes, they had to be immediately registered, released from enslavement, but then could be immediately indentured, all in the same contract. And that was the case a year after Mary Bateman Clark came to Indiana with Benjamin J. Harrison. In 1815, a few years after he arrived, Harrison sold the indenture contract, which means he sold Mary Bateman Clark to Johnston for $350. Now, let me tell you a little about who G.W. Johnston is. General Washington Johnston, as I said, brought masonry into the state, but Johnston was also a territorial legislator and then a state legislator. He was a state representative. He was a judge. He was fluent in French, and he was always sought out to help translate, because at that time, Knox County had a strong French-speaking population. Lots of folks had French heritage and spoke French. So Johnson was a translator for them. He served in many other positions, from postmaster to he handled property. He owned substantial property in Indiana and Kentucky. But he owned the contract from Mary Bateman Clark. Amory Kinney, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, sued Johnston for Mary Bateman Clark's freedom. At the circuit court level, which is the local court down in Knox County in Vincennes, she lost that case. Between the time that he lost that case and the case was taken to the Supreme Court, Amory Kinney was beat up on the streets of Knox County, and he left the city and moved to Terre Haute, Indiana. His law partner took the case to the Supreme Court in Corydon, Indiana at that time. And the Supreme Court on November 6, 1821, ruled in Mary Bateman Clark's favor and released her from the indentured servitude contract. Now, this case is still cited in courts today because it deals with personal services. Can you make your hairdresser do your hair? Can you force your mechanic to fix your car? So this was considered a personal services case. And this case is still cited in court cases involving personal services today. So I have a rendering of Mary Clark and Polly Strong. This is Polly Strong. This is Mary Clark here. Can't see her real well, but this is what we imagine they look like, although we don't know for sure. Now, a little about Amory Kinney. Amory Kinney was an abolitionist from Vermont. He was the son of a minister, a Congregationalist minister. He moved to Knox and Daviess County and then to Terre Haute, but he moved all across southern Indiana. I'm certain that he had cases in Lawrence as well. There needs to be more research and documentation on him. He is definitely an unsung hero. He advocated for free schools. He became a legislator in Vigo. He was on the town council. He was a presiding judge. He was the founder of the newspaper there, along with a co-founder, the Western Register, and he helped to found the first Congregational church in Terre Haute in 1835. And so, there's just a tremendous amount of achievement under his belt, and nobody's ever heard of him. General Washington, as I said earlier, was the founder of the Masonic Lodge Number 1. F&AM stands for Free and Accepted Masons. He was the first man admitted to the bar to practice law. He fought at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and his list of achievement is could fill up this page. Right today in the cemetery, in the Green Line Cemetery there in Knox County, is this huge monument to him that the Masons had erected in the 1920s. And so every so often they have a big wang dang doodle, I call it, in Knox County, paying homage to this man. And like I said, he was considered a nice man in all respects, wonderful person, but he was still a slave owner. Now, we've had historical markers installed for Polly Strong. This is her marker, and it's located in Corydon. And this is one of the ways that we stop erasure of heritage and history by putting up these historical markers. These markers in Lawrence County, if we could get a group together there, could do the very same thing. Everything starts with research, and documented and source research it must be. So it's a two-sided marker. It costs about $3,200. We have funding to help pay for the marker, so that won't be an object of our issue. Here's the marker that I had put up, installed in Knox County in front of the courthouse. And you see, it talks about her, and it mentions G.W. Johnson and Amory Kinney, and it's really interesting because when some historians learn more about this story, because I've been researching the story for 40 years, they begin also telling this story. But the framing of the story was different for me versus the way they framed the story. The way many of these researchers framed the story was that Mary Bateman Clark was a pawn in this battle between these two tremendous forces. And I don't disagree that they used this case, that the attorneys used this case to test this issue. I don't disagree at all. But I doubt seriously she was a pawn. And one of the main reasons and pieces of evidence that I located was the numerous times that on her own went after G.W. Johnston to seek the financial judgment that was awarded her in the Supreme Court, which was $24.44.5. She never got the money. However, she tried to get it for years. She died in 1839 of dysentery, and so bad water, polluted water is what killed her. So I wrote a book about her and her story, and it's a historical fiction. It tells about Black life in Vincennes, and I wrote it as a historical fiction because I wanted these people to have a voice. So I was able to use dialogue. I was able to show the French influence on all of the African American community there because many of them did speak French, and that was documented in newspapers and articles frequently. So I wrote this book about her case and what led up to it and what happened. And a lot of it is my imagination, but the facts of the case are the facts of the case. And it includes a lot of my own family genealogy. And I always encourage people to, it's a quick read. If you open your phone on this QR code, it'll take you to the Amazon site where you can order it. It's a love story. It talks about her husband, Sam Clark, who was enslaved by the Decker family. Now, you all probably been down, 41 and know there's Decker, Indiana, Decker Township, and Decker businesses. Well, it was Luke Decker who owned Mary Clark's husband. And that was confirmed in an article in the early 1900s, quoting Luke Decker's grandson, Henry, saying that yes, his grandfather was a slave owner and Luke owned Sam Clark. Sam Clark was with Luke Decker at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and that's been documented as well, as were other African American men. They were in that battle. Now they went there to serve their enslavers. However, I am certain they just weren't sitting around ducking arrows, so they were in war too. Now we produced a documentary, which is another way that we stop erasure. And this is a trailer, and it's about the Mary Bateman Clark story. My sister and I, for 10 years, we've traveled all over the state presenting the story. She would do a reenactment of Mary Clark. I would do a little lecture, and it was entertaining, but we did it for adults and children. And for children, it brought the story of Mary Clark and this history to life. And I hope you can hear this. This is about 2 minutes long, so I'm going to play it.
This is the story of Mary Bateman Clark. She was a 20-year-old slave, was brought to Vincennes, Indiana in 1815. She was coerced into becoming an indentured servant. And through courageous actions, she won her freedom in a landmark case decision by the Indiana Supreme Court. It's also a story of a more than 30-year quest made by her great-great-great-granddaughters, Eunice Trotter and Ethel McCain, to uncover and tell Mary's remarkable history.
And if I had not put my X on that paper and venturing myself to that General Washington Johnston, they could have scooped me up, carried me back down south, and put me back in slavery.
It's just amazing that Ethel and Eunice have been able to trace their roots all the way back to Mary Clark, and that they've been able to make that connection. It's just a story that's worth telling.
Peoples ain't supposed to own and sell other peoples like so much cattle and such.
I was a true believer in knowing your roots and your history, your family history. And it was just such a really exciting journey because it was like a huge puzzle, the biggest one you've ever seen. A lot of African American families can't trace their heritage back 2 generations, let alone to the extent that we've been able to do this.
not only was all of this history a part of our lives, but that we had the power to bring that history to light today. But they use that long word indenture, mean taking you out of slavery just to put you back in again.
I want them to take away this legacy she left and the hope that they will create their own legacy.
It's about pride and dignity. One reason I wasn't gonna be no slave. No slave, no kind of way whatsoever.
They're prepared to say something that they know is not going to be universally accepted, something which would have been resisted by some people, but they do it anyway.
The Mary Clark story is one chapter in the much larger story of slavery and freedom. And in my understanding of American history, that big story of slavery and freedom is at the very center of the history of all of us. She was a fighter for liberty, and is to be honored for that, because not only did she win her own freedom, but she also was the means for assuring freedom for all the others.
Coming back to carry me.
So that is a 1 hour documentary that's shown on PBS. The Bloomington station airs it or used to, I should say, air it every Black History Month. So I don't know if they're airing it this month. I might call them. People will call sometimes and get them to air it anyway. And sometimes Indianapolis picks it up. But this is a state history story. And so this documentary was produced by some professors from IU in Bloomington. They are still partners with me to this day, producing other documentaries around the state about Black history. So I want to speed this up and bring you up through the 1830s. With the Clark case being settled in 1821, setting a precedent so that other African Americans didn't have to go to the Supreme Court. They could go to the circuit court, and then that judge would be forced to rule in their favor to release them from these contracts. So along comes the 1830s. More and more African Americans are coming into Indiana from slave states. This is when the Indiana Colonization Society began. And so the motive for it was to provide a better place for these African Americans who were born here, maybe had been here for multiple generations, but were never welcomed here. So the idea was send them back to Africa. So the country carved out an area in Africa, and where the arrow is, you'll see that's where it is. Liberia, here. Sierra Leone is north of it. And you see all these other cities. All of these communities had tribes that had different languages. So all of these people, thousands of Black people were shipped to Liberia. If they didn't want to go, no one forced them. But in many cases, enslavers said, either you go or you're back in slavery. And so that was the inducement for a lot of them to go. They had emissaries go and come back with these glowing reports. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of African Americans who went there were slaughtered by the existing tribes who did not want them there. Many of these people were mixed race people. They weren't the same culture. They didn't speak the same language, nothing. It's, you remember when Sam Doe was president of Liberia during the war there? Well, we use the word John Doe. His name was Sam Doe, but it's evidence of the American roots of that man and his lineage, because many of those people kept their American names. And they named their towns for American cities and named their streets for American places. So that still goes on to this day. So in the 1830s, the Indiana legislature passed a policy requiring Blacks who were in the state to register with local authorities and to pay a $500 bond. Now, who in the world had $500 to pay? In many cases around Indiana, Blacks left the state. So you'll see a population decrease in the 1830s. But you'll see an increase in Underground Railroad activity. And you see here is Lawrence County. Where am I at? Yeah, here. But you'll see that it's near Underground Railroad sites. These red areas, we've been able to confirm the Underground Railroad activity, but we have a lot more work to do. We did identify settlements all over the state that existed before the Civil War. In Indiana, in Indiana, Blacks could and did buy land. And this is how they were able to create communities. So you see here is where, even though it's not marked, here's Lawrence County here, and you'll see two areas of settlement there. One just in south of Monroe County, one in Martin County. And I'm sure a lot of folks from Lawrence are familiar with Lick Creek settlement in Orange County. That's now in the Hoosier National Forest. It's reverted to nature. The cemetery's still there, but there's no other evidence really there much. There's a church there as well, but there's been a battle with the AME church over access to that church. I want to show you some of the other settlements around the state that we're working in to stop the erasure. You see the picture on the left is the way that we found the Lao Station School. This was the place. A school wasn't just a school in the Black community. It was everything. A church wasn't just a church. It was everything. So on these grounds, which is an agricultural setting, there was this school. Next door is a church, a cemetery, housing all around. There was a post office. This community was established and settled in the 1840s. And again, it had fallen into this. Here it is today. It is now a museum. Kids come in and they learn about farm life. They learn about that settlement. They learn history here in this building. A lot of children have the opportunity to go through that site and learn. I'm just going to show you some quick pictures of some other families in various settlements around the state. And I wanted to say also that many of these settlements were established first by mulatto people. Now, these are biracial people, typically the offspring of an enslaver or his staff. And these people were among the first to be released from enslavement when a slaveholder felt altruistic and desired to free his enslaved people. He started with people who were probably his sons and daughters. So these people moved, sometimes with the enslavers, sometimes without, to various communities in the North. And you can see the biraciality in some of these people, but I want to say here, you cannot tell a book by a cover. There is an increasing number of biracial people in America today and in Indiana, definitely. And where it had been Black moms for these children and the child was in the same condition as the mother in terms of race and enslavement, that is no longer the case. There are many white moms who have biracial children, and it is changing the complexion of our community. So there are many African Americans then in the 1800s and today that you cannot tell are Black by looking at them. This is Lick Creek. We visited the cemetery there. This is a picture of one of the headstones there. But Lick Creek is in the National Forest, and we hiked all through there to get way back in the woods, and there's the cemetery there, and it needs work. We could see foundations of buildings, but this is the kind of condition that we went through to see that site. In Terre Haute, this is another family. This is a mulatto family. Now it's hard to see the complexions in these old pictures, but this was definitely a mulatto family in Lost Creek in Vigo County. And by the way, I'm from a mulatto family. My grandmother is Caucasian. My father's biracial. She was from Gibson County. But to look at me, you would think I have no Caucasian blood in me at all, okay? But my grandmother is Caucasian. So it comes, all of these folks into this community, a growing number. There's a lot of alarm. It's sort of like what we're dealing with today with Mexicans coming in. More and more people are becoming alarmed that there's so many here. I know when I was a reporter at the Star, Mexicans had a show of force, is what I called it. And this was like in the early 2000s, 2002 or 3, something like that. So it's been, more than 20 years ago. And we heard that they were going to have a demonstration. And I tell you, I went outside to see it, and they were parading down Delaware Street, which is a very busy street that's closed off the street. Mexicans as far as the eye can see in every direction. So for me, that was alarming. I was like, what? Oh, this many Mexicans in Indianapolis? Where have they been? So that was the feeling that existed when African Americans began migrating here. So in 1851, Indiana adopted a new constitution. And in that constitution, there is Article 13. And Article 13 says no blacks can come into the state, period. None. And, just like I just told you, sometimes you can't tell who's black and who's not. But this article required Negro and mulatto registers. All contracts that had existed with black entrepreneurs were canceled. And this law stayed on the books until it was declared invalid in 1866. So this historian, his name is Coy Robbins, he went all over the state looking for these registers, and he found 19 of them. There are more to be found. I cannot find Lawrence counties yet, but Lawrence County did have a register, and it did require blacks to register as required by the state's constitution. So if anyone's digging in any records in the courthouse and comes across this list of names of black folks with descriptions of their appearance and so forth, please, it will be a valuable find. So after the Civil War, the immigration of African Americans really picked up, and they were pouring into Indiana, running out of the South, because it was so harsh there in the South. I've had so many stories about the conditions there. You would think, just like I used to think, well, why didn't those people defend themselves? They knew how to use guns and weapons. Well, if they defended themselves and caused the loss of life or injury to a Caucasian person, that meant their imminent death. So their choice was to take whatever came or run, and many chose to leave those places. Now, this increasing influx of African Americans into Indiana created the resulting terrorism that began to just be prolific all throughout the state, starting with this organization called the National Horse Thief Detective Association. And Lawrence County had one. And they had this organization. This organization was supported by the Indiana legislature, and the men, the only members could be white men who owned property, were deputized to arrest people. And their purpose originally was to stop horse thievery. Because, if someone's horse was stolen, that was the end of their everything. It's just like if someone took your car, like, oh my God, how am I going to get to work? I'm going to get to the grocery. Well, for people in that time, no horsemen, how am I going to plow how am I gonna do anything? They needed these horses. So they formed this organization to stop horse thievery, but it evolved into a terroristic organization. It began to affiliate with various organizations that were anti-Catholic, anti-Jew, anti-Black, anti. But they were supposed to have been organizations that were stopping horse thievery. They started that way. Now you'll see here where this red arrow is pointing. That is a list in 1917 of Lawrence County Horse Thief Association officers. And all of these folks are from Mitchell. Edward Haverly, J.A. Munger, A.B. Hall, and C.H. Smith. Each year, this organization would meet at a different place, and they always printed a list of all the officers of each of their member cities. And you see Marion County, that's Indianapolis, they had theirs too. There were other organizations that were pushing back against the migration of African Americans into Indiana. And those groups included groups with names like the White Caps. And the White Caps and regulators, they started out to be moral police, if you will. They would beat white men and women if these people were doing something that these members of these groups thought was immoral. Like, for example, adultery. They would publicly whip a woman or a man for adultery, for domestic abuse and so forth. And so but then they evolved into a racist group. Of course, we all know about the KKK and the Aryan Freedom Network and the newer groups, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. They're all part of the same kind of organizations, and Lawrence County has some of them. But I tell you one thing that I've learned about Lawrence County that I really love. I was looking at some of these posts when the Klan leafleted communities in Bedford, and people were outraged, and they were vocal about that outrage, which I think that's what a community has to do to dissuade these kinds of groups from, expanding in our communities. So I could just show, there were dozens and dozens of people saying, get them out of Bedford. So we talked about how erasure happens with the government plan clearance and all of that, and the National Recovery Act. We saw the pictures of the avenue of the highway. Now I want to show you some communities that got it. Now here in Indianapolis was Indiana Avenue. You'll see all of these buildings, they're all now gone. Each of these buildings had storefront Black-owned businesses all up and down. Oh, I would imagine it's a 10-block stretch from downtown Indianapolis all the way west to White River. This is a picture of the Martindale area, churches and schools. The church and the school are both still standing. We have both of these now going on the National Register. This is the community, the Martindale community. All of this is gone. All of these homes have been demolished and being replaced by homes that I know I can't afford. So, young, upwardly mobile couples. We have a joke in some of these neighborhoods. When you see the joggers, it's over. So, you might have heard of Eagle Creek in Indianapolis. Eagle Creek is a man-made creek in Indianapolis on property owned formerly by the Lilly family. The Lilly family acquired that property through purchasing it from a group of family members who were part of a Black settlement. The only thing that's left now, that's evidence that that community ever existed, is this big rock at Eagle Creek with this plaque that talks about Mount Pleasant Baptist Church, which started in 1893. And then we have found ads in the newspapers talking about the church. and so forth. This was in what was a suburban area of Indianapolis at the time, but it's gone. And then I want to talk a little about Green Lawn Cemetery before I close. Green Lawn Cemetery is the name given to actually 4 of Indianapolis's earliest cemeteries. Now, this is an issue that is occurring all over the state and all over the country. This cemetery opened in 1821 with this area here called the Old Burying Grounds. In this area here were the earliest pioneers buried. It was a public cemetery. It didn't cost anything, and people were placed there. On the outskirts of that cemetery, we believe was a colored burial ground. There's evidence in records and newspaper articles. This is White River up and down this area where you see these lines. All of this is White River. So as time went, there was erosion and bodies floated down and up the river from this cemetery. And there are several articles that talked about, these dead people becoming uncovered. This cemetery became overcrowded, so this part was added, and then this part, and then this part. And even though only this part was actually called Green Lawn Cemetery, this entire site became known as Green Lawn Cemetery. Here on Kentucky Avenue, which is right across the street from Lucas Oil Stadium, was where Diamond Chain was built. Diamond Chain is no longer there. A developer tore down the building, which was on the National Register, by the way. And during the demolition, more bodies were uncovered, even though the developer and others said that most, if not all, of the people who had been buried in all 4 of these sections had been removed and reinterred in other cemeteries over time. Confederate soldiers were buried here, Union soldiers were buried here, and they were both relocated. In this area, there was an excavation here in 1858 and again in 1924, and it was believed all the bodies were removed. But we know that if you didn't have money, you weren't going to be moved. And so that was the case for many people, including many people in this colored burial ground. Well, the city wants to build a bridge and is building a bridge. So for a year, we fought the city about that bridge. Not that we didn't want the bridge, but we wanted them to do the right thing in excavating that ground. So here's the bridge that is under construction right now. This bridge connects the east side of White River to the west side, where there's a Elanco plant built. Elanco is going to be servicing animals with medications and so forth. So that plant is being built right now. All along this area where you see these arrows is where the cemetery is, but the cemetery expands all the way back where you see Indy 11. That is the proposed new minor league soccer field. These buildings don't exist right now, but this is what is proposed for that area. It's a beautiful development, but it is going to be developed on top of a cemetery where we believe thousands of people are still buried. So we pushed back and pushed back. I mean, it got ugly, right down to threatening to put us in jail. But when the developer was found to not have enough financing, money talking here, the city began pulling away from that project and supporting that project because the developer didn't have what it takes to do the job to get this done. And then when we discovered all of these people were still buried there, this means they have to excavate them and reinter them. So, that would cost millions and millions of dollars just for this area where the bridge is going, this area that's being built here, over $12 million and counting, and the price is going up. And they've discovered not even digging any depth, just in clearing the land so they can do excavation work, 200 vaults of remains. When Diamond Chain was torn down, which was located back in this area, in an area that's been built upon and bodies have been discovered, remains have been discovered since the 1920s. another 200 remains. So we know that there are probably hundreds of people still left buried there. That is our history. This is our heritage. We did not care about it in past generations because we allowed this cemetery to fall into disrepair. The excavators now are finding layers of people in that cemetery, 3 and 4 people buried on top of each other over the years. So one of the ways that we're also stopping erasure is by documenting it and providing an application that will allow for a walking tour, so that even though everything is gone, we still tell the story of that history. And this is GIS driven. It's on, you access it through your cell phone. And we're working on an application to show Indiana Avenue, Graham Martin Park, Georgetown and Madison, Lafayette, and the Martindale area, which is a historically Black community here in Indianapolis. So erasure means people lose the knowledge of culture. It's a loss of generational wealth, and on and on. You know, these sites are essential to people's healing from trauma. They need these sites to feel safe and to remain healthy. So I always say that Black history is part of the full story of our history. And without that history, we are not telling the full story. So we're looking for allies to help save this history, to document this history, just to help us do this work that is just going to have tremendous generational impact. We know that when children know their history, they act out less in school, they get better grades, they have fewer emotional problems, they don't feel like the world revolves around them. So with that, I have talked your head off and mine too, and I'm going to stop right here. And I'm just would be open to any questions. If I haven't worn you out here, I would just like to just hear any questions you might have, or comments as well.
Hello, Eunice. My name is Janine's son. It's been over a year since I spoke to you. And I want to tell you that the statue is in progress.
Okay, all right now. You're out loud. Thank you. Good girl. Thank you so much for giving me that update. Thank you. Well, I know that this is a lot for people, you know, to hear all of this. It is a lot. And it's overwhelming. You know, every day my head is spinning because I'm learning something every single day. But if, you know, if I didn't just overwhelm you with this stuff, you know, and you got anything out of it, I hope that what you got out of it is the need for us to save this history in our communities, because Lawrence County has rich history. And that full story, it includes many different people.
Well, we'll keep working on the research for that, Eunice, and I appreciate some of there were new things like the clan stories. I had never seen those. So there's a lot of stuff. We did have indenture, we do actually have indenture records right here at the museum. We've seen them, and I think he only scanned all the ones that they weren't all actually African Americans. Some of them were white children also, but
Yeah,
we scanned the ones that pertain to our research. So
that's
if
great.
you want to see
That's
those
great.
sometime, we'll look them up.
I would love to. Yeah, I would love to. Yeah, I knew that indentures were for all kind of people, but those children didn't get indenture for 99 years.
Yeah, no, they were not.
Yeah. Indenture just till they were grown, and that was the difference. But those were the laws that were used to enslave. So
Yeah.
that's how they did that.
That's a problem. Anybody else have questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, if I was there, I would give people a hug, because you know that's so I'm gonna give you a virtual hug. Thank you so much for allowing me to talk to you tonight.
Thank
And I
you.
appreciate each one of you.